Morning, everyone. I'm just waiting for some people to start coming in. Morning. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes just to let everyone come in. Right, just a little bit of housekeeping. There might be some questions that come out throughout the chat, which is totally fine. If you would use the Q&A function to pop any of those questions in rather than the chat, so we can just keep an eye on it. And yes, so I will now hand over to Cheryl, who is the HR Director of Clarion and is running this session on change management with Jay Stone, who is the founder of Stone Changes. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jo. So Jay, it's great to see you in the flesh. You and I had a quick chat yesterday, but it's good to see you.
It's really, really lovely to be here, Cheryl, with you. Thank you.
Great. I think we can all agree, can't we, that the words change and the words uncertainty have certainly been on all of our minds in the last 12 months. They're words that have been used to describe how we're feeling, how our people are feeling, how our family are feeling. So, inside work, outside work. And I'm really interested and ask you to talk about how we can develop the mindsets and perspectives that we need to thrive in uncertainty and constant change, because I think it's a fact that's not going to change for a while, is it?
Exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Cheryl, with they've used the word unprecedented, which we, most of us just sort of cry away from now every time we hear it. We've heard it so much, but it is because it's been coming at us from all angles. And you talked about, coming from a personal point of view, a professional point of view. And I think the key question that I often get is, how do we make this a positive thing? How do we distinguish whether it's positive or negative? And I think the only thing we know for certain is that change will continue. And what we know is it's going to continue fast. If anyone's heard the term VUCA, we're living through that more than ever. VUCA environment, highly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we've been hearing this across the business world so much. And it's cutting across our lives now. I think it was Jim Collins. He's a great researcher in the world of sort of business. He said, uncertainty is permanent. Chaotic times are normal. Change is accelerating, and instability will likely characterize the rest of our lives. So I think the most important sort of mindset shift or perception I think we need to make is, instead of thinking, okay, how are we going to get everyone back to normal in this moment of rebuilding, I think we need to think about how can we up our tolerance for uncertainty? How can we build not only our own, but our team's sort of change capability? How do we learn to change well? Because ultimately, where there's change, there is also opportunity. We just have to look through history, just think about something like the horse and cart was, made redundant with the invention of sort of cars and the motor, and sort of as a result of that, huge amounts of redundancies. However, the development of the car created a whole load of jobs that didn't exist before. And you think about GDPR, right? again, that alone created something, I think it was like 75,000 jobs. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that with change, there comes a sense of loss. And recognizing that, but it also presents us with great opportunity. And another great quote that I love, Helen Keller, she was an author and educator, blind and deaf, and she was one of the first women to graduate from college in the US. But she says, when one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we don't necessarily see the one that is open for us. So I think, yeah, you know, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why humans, I think we focus on the negative, because we're wired that way. We're wired for negativity, something called negativity bias. And this was fascinating to me because I was like, oh gosh, like how, you know, we talk about sort of positive mindsets, but we're actually wired to consider the negative far more powerfully. Because if we think about survival and the way our brains are designed to ensure our survival, it's far more likely that we're going to survive if we consider the negative things that could happen, the threat that is around, the possible threat, than it is to think about the fluffy unicorns and, you know, the positive stuff. So our brains are wired to think about the loss and the negative side of things. So we really, really have to sort of counter that. I think we have to acknowledge that as a human trait.
I bet. And how do we do that? Because cognitively, we know that we know that our brains haven't evolved at the pace that time has. But how do we actually do that?
Yeah. And I think this is a subject matter that I have just been fascinated by. And the reason I'm fascinated by, because like many, it touched my life, you know, change touched my life in such a personal way. It was about 6 years ago. My mum passed away in my mid-20s. And so that was a huge sort of personal change in my life. At the time I was working in events. I was working for an events company, an international trade show, and we went through a huge restructure and my whole team was dissolved. 2 levels above me, good friends of mine, but also mentors, and obviously sort of my trajectory that I thought I was going up were made redundant. And it was, you know, it was this sort of, this mix of personal and professional change that really just whipped the rug from straight under my feet. And I remember feeling so powerless and so out of control of my own life situation. My whole sense of identity, I think, was at question as I sort of grappled with, okay, well, what does this change mean? What does it mean if I can't play this role, in this team? And I became the resistant employee. And this is what I call myself, you know, because I was probably every type of resistant employee that I now coach through various forms of, you know, workplace change. I was difficult in meetings. I completely checked out. I gossiped and was cynical about the changes being implemented. I lashed out. And, you know, you talk about the way our brain is wired. It is actually, you know, my behavior, what I came to realize was that my behavior is very, very common. You know, we either shut down or we lash out. It's very common because of there's actually a neurological reason why our brains resist change. So let me just explain this very, very quickly, only because it's relevant to some of the solutions that we can put in place very, very easily. And I'll try and keep this short, but also if there are any neuroscientists listening to this, I apologize profusely.
Don't judge me.
For this oversimplification of the brain, which is on the most basic level, right? Your brain is actually working against you when it comes to change and uncertainty, right? It hates it. And that's because the oldest part of our brain, it's the part that has, as you mentioned, it hasn't changed much for millennia. And it existed in our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and it's the part of the brain that's wired for survival. So it's only interested in keeping you safe and survive long enough. It's not even concerned with your happiness. Happiness isn't even a concern of that, you know, at that part of the brain. It's only concerned with you reproducing and keeping the human species thriving. When we consider the lives of our ancestors, any unknowns, any uncertainties, change, not being in control meant that they were exposed and vulnerable to being eaten by a lion, say, right? The more familiar situation, you stay in your cave, the more safe it will be. So for anyone who's watched The Croods, the animated adapt or die picture from, you know, the dad who's like, change is bad, new is bad. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So that oldest part of the brain, I call it the chimp brain. Okay. And that's just survival. Now, the other part of your brain, which is the newer part, the part that's quite unique to humans, it's the executive brain. That's our problem solving, that's our critical thinking, that's how we've been able to create the innovations we've created. What essentially happens is when we're in a state of threat, and by threat, this could be a physical attack, like being attacked by a lion, or it could be a psychological threat, you know, change and uncertainty going around us, a stressful period of time at work. You've just been asked to do some public speaking to 1,000 people. Your body is going to go into threat mode, and it's going to react in exactly the same way it will if you were being attacked by a lion. So that's anything new. So anything new you're embarking on, it's going to, your brain is going to feed you with excuses and insecurities. It's going to feed you anything to prevent you from stepping outside of your comfort zone and doing anything that it doesn't know, because that's unsafe. So what happens is you go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. It goes, woof, we're in a threat, there's change going on, there's a period of change at work. What does that mean in terms of, you know, am I going to be competent at this new thing? That's a fear, that's a threat. Am I, you know, for me, it was moving into a new team. Am I going to be rejected from that team? You know, they're not my team. That fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of not being competent anymore. So we jump into fight, flight, or freeze. The problem with fight, flight, or freeze is there are certain things that happen on our body. And this is why we can't talk about change without talking about stress, challenge, mind fog, whatever you've been experiencing right now, exhaustion. There's good reason for it. Your body jumps into this fight, flight, or freeze, and there's certain reactions that occur in your body. So things like you tense up, you get really stressed. So when you're really stressed, your body tenses up. That's because your body is prioritizing blood to your limbs so it can either fight the danger or run away. So what that means is that it's diverting blood from your brain to your limbs. So what does that mean? You lose your brain function. You lose the ability, that executive function of your brain. So the more emotional side, the bit that's just wants you to survive, takes over, and out goes critical thinking, out goes creativity. People have sort of said to me, I just feel like foggy. There's this block. They can't even start looking forward, you know, being strategic with their thinking, because they're so consumed by this immediate threat. It makes us very narrow-minded. So we can't think beyond the short term because we're so consumed with, this is a threat that I've got to deal with. I've got to be on high alert. And
it's interesting, sorry, just to interrupt, I also think that then people just stick with what they know, what they've always done, what's normal for them, because they don't have that headspace to be able to think about and welcome what could be.
What could be, exactly. And it goes back to the point, change always, an opportunity is always there in change, but we just can't see it. You know, our brain isn't even looking for it. You know, we're wondering why we're not moving forward because our brain is, you know, almost shutting down. It doesn't want you to. And so this is a really, really important part of how do we overcome that? How do we deal with that? Because we've got to deal with this first. If we start thinking about the future, we just get overwhelmed, and we're unable to make those steps. So
what I really like about what I'm hearing is that everybody's doing exactly the same of what you've just described. It's just some people have learned to manage it better or recognize it and learn techniques to be able to overcome it. But each and every one of us is you know, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is going through that thought process.
Absolutely. This isn't something that you can get rid of. We can't, that's one of the things that I have to teach. It's not something you can eradicate, and you wouldn't want to, right? This survival response is critical to our survival as a species. When somebody's attacking you, you want that stress response to kick in immediately. But you're right, even, you know, even somebody who knows this, it happens to me. You know, my dad, over COVID situation, he was rushed into hospital. He was in hospital for 3 months in a coma. They told us 3 times he wasn't going to make it. And this is somebody who has experienced a parent, you know, passing away. I knew what to expect. I work in change and uncertainty. I work in the coaching field. I know a lot about psychology, and yet even I succumbed to this reaction, this threat mode. And often it transpires in 2 ways. So you either go into overfunctioning, or underfunctioning. So overfunctioning are those sort of, it tends to be sort of those high achievers, you know, the people who are very action orientated. And this tends to be our gang, right? Events, ops, professionals, project people. We need stuff to do. We need that to feel useful. And so we jump into overfunctioning. And we tend to take control of situations. We often inadvertently end up controlling other people in our need for control. We can use that busy as an avoidance tactic. So, you know, avoidance in a short term is an okay coping mechanism. Over long time, you know, this is where you get overwork, burnout. These people are far more likely to burn out, and the pace that they're going
not sustainable.
Is not sustainable for them or their people. Leaders in this overfunctioning space, fine for short periods of time, very, very dangerous or in a long term, because you're driving your whole team to burnout. They can't keep up. They feel incompetent in the shadow of the overfunctioner. And the other one is the underfunctioner. And I can fall into this, even though I'm a, you know, fast-paced person. I'm one of 5 kids, so I've got loads of older siblings. And what tends to happen in group dynamics is usually the higher up in the authority you are, probably you're going to go to overfunctioning. The lower, you're going to go to underfunctioning.
Interesting.
So underfunctioning is you take a step back, you almost go in to yourself, you're prone to checking out, you tend to let others take over. Sometimes you can be viewed as not competent because you're not the one sort of stepping forward. And for me, you know, the whole situation with my dad, I went into underfunctioning at home, overfunctioning at work. So it's important for us to sometimes recognize where we're at in here, because whilst there's no good or bad necessarily, these are coping mechanisms that we need to implement in stressful situations. When we're overusing any of one of these, they can have side effects. Like I mentioned, for an overfunctioner, you're going into burnout. You can create toxic environment, especially if you're a leader in overfunctioner. And that can be really, really difficult when you're managing and leading change, because what you don't want to do is treat change like, oh, we're just going to get through this and then it will be all fine. Because every time you roll out a new change initiative, you're going to have memories of the experience that people had, and people are going to act based on what you did before. And if they feel like it was a toxic environment or whatever that was, that can be a dangerous space. And for the underfunctioner, we can get highly overwhelmed. We can completely check out. We also engage in those avoidance strategies. So instead of dealing with our situation, we avoid them. So we've got to acknowledge where we're at and just see if we can move ourselves along that spectrum a bit.
It sounds as though sort of self-inquiry and recognizing what your patterns are key to this. Would you agree?
Absolutely. You know, and interesting, I was reading up on the World Economic Forum, and they did some research with global companies on what the top 10 job skills are for the future. So for 2025, one of them is self-management, such as resilience, stress tolerance, and flexibility. So amongst many others, I think 9 others, it was that self-management piece. I call it self-mastery. And this is really, really key, especially as sort of a manager or a leader. And I think one of the practical ways, let's get really practical for a moment. One of the things for me was, especially I'm a control freak, I admit that, hands up, control freak. And so when I feel like, you know, I think that's why I got into events and project management in the first place, because I bring sort of structure to chaos, you know, and I'm like, now it's all organized and I've got my list. So when we feel out of control, like we don't have choices, like everything's uncertain, this is going to trigger our stress response. Obviously, just think about, you know, a cat. You back a cat into a corner. Your hackles are going to go up, and you're going to go straight into threat mode. So now we can either engage in healthy mechanisms to gain control or unhealthy mechanisms. And this self-management piece, this managing ourselves piece, I think is a healthy way we can do it. Unhealthy ways, you know, for me, I was, you know, stuck in a 2-year battle with bulimia after my mum died, and this whole period of change happened because I think for me, I was trying to grab hold of something external so I could control my body, I could control what I ate, and it was a very, very unhealthy coping mechanism. So that's what can happen when we don't engage in these self-management techniques.
At an extreme.
That's an extreme, right? And lesser so, and from a management point of view, this can come out as unintentional micromanagement. We try to gain some element of control, and we want to make sure everyone feels okay. And so we take control of the situation, and we're just like, it's going to be okay. And we almost bubble wrap people from the you know, the change, instead of allowing them to build that resilience to do it. So those are the things that can be unhealthy mechanisms. So how can we engage in some healthy ones? One of the ways is focusing our attention on what we do have control over. So this is really simple. You know, what I found from my research are those individuals who could bounce back quickly, who are really agile, who remained resilient, and those leaders who are very, very effective in times of crisis helped their teams and themselves to focus on what they do have control over. So when we focus on things that we don't have control over, like we watch the news, you know, we overconsume, or, you know, I get annoyed about, you know, trying to fix climate change all by myself, that
by tomorrow.
By tomorrow, that becomes overwhelming, and then that makes me anxious, and then that's the downward spiral. So this is a technique I learned from Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's an incredible book, and he calls it the circle of control. It's very simple. You draw out a circle, and that circle is called your circle of concern. And in that circle, you want to put everything that you're concerned about, but you know that you don't necessarily have control over. So for me, it's climate control, climate change. You know, for you, it might be the potential of losing my job, having to make my team redundant, whatever that is. And then in the inner circle, you draw another circle inside, and that's called your circle of influence. And those things in your circle of influence are related to your circle of concern. So they're related. So mine would be related to climate change, but they're things that I have direct influence over. So I can make sure that my dad's set up with all the recycling bins. I can recommend to my friends eco-friendly, you know, options. That's what I'm in control of. And if I stay there, I'm not going to spiral. And so that's a really, really sort of short-term thing that we can do with our teams and get our teams familiar with as well. Let's focus on the things that we can actually set KPIs to, set objectives to.
That sounds like a really, really tangible tool that you can use when you're feeling at overwhelm before it sort of travels up the curve to stress. You know, a word very much that's used at the moment. I really liked your reference to, you know, what the world values in terms of our future successful people, great performance, great leadership, because I think a lot of people have felt that the last year their career and their development and their next steps are not as clear as perhaps they were, and I really like the fact that you've sort of talked about what is being valued going forward. What would you say to people who perhaps are feeling a little bit lost in their development, and how can they grow those behaviours that you just talked about, that are so valuable in the world that we work in today?
Absolutely. I think, You know, I think initially when this whole situation happened with my company and I realized how uncertain the job market is, I realized, you know, I'm not going to have this 40-year career that many others had. That just doesn't exist anymore. The rate of change is too fast.
Yeah.
And I sort of realized in that moment, oh gosh, like if the only thing for certain is uncertainty, I need to up my tolerance for uncertainty. I need to understand what those skill sets are, but also I think, you know, it can be comforting to attempt to seek out a recession-proof career, you know, and what we know is that is just not the case. Every industry is open to economic impact. And so I think the best avenue that I've been able to sort of, and this is from a personal point of view, is sort of building that choice into my career path. And a big part of the mindset shift that I had to make personally was to stay curious. And I call it the explorer's mindset, but many call it, you know, the experimental mindset or the scientist mindset. And it's about taking, so for me, it's about taking an explorer's approach, right? You're committing to undertaking an iterative process of trying and adjusting and trying again. And like any experiment or new exploration, right, there are going to be some wrong turns. There's going to be some big bangs. And that, you know, I found some certainty in that. I knew that was the one thing I could hold on to. There are going to be some failures and there are going to be some wrong turns. But I think being open to that explorer's mindset, remaining curious instead of engaging in fear, has really, really helped me in terms of a mindset to approach my career in a far more flexible way. Because I had a very clear trajectory in mind. I was going to go to my boss's role and then her, and then maybe I'd become the CEO of this events company. And, you know, like many of us, our careers are more squiggly than sort of that straight career path. So I think that they're like, have comfort in that it's meant to be squiggly. And
absolutely. And it's not linear. It's not, you know, you're not going to become the assistant, the exec, the manager, the director. It is, for me, you know, I talk to people about identify the skills and the tools that are going to be really useful for you going forward, and then go search opportunities out to practice those skills and practice those behaviors, and sort of you collect those in your toolbox, so that you are armed to be flexible. What I heard then was very much around leaders needing to provide an open, curious, brave, where humility is celebrated, culture and environment in their teams. How can leaders do that?
I think this is such an interesting topic because I think it's critical. And, you know, I was listening to one of like Google X's TED Talks the other day, and they talked about in Google where employees are publicly applauded by their co-workers and supervisors for failing. They're publicly applauded. It's celebrated because they know that in order to innovate, in order to experiment, in order to create this psychologically safe, I mean, we can talk about psychologically safe environments. That's a really critical one. Psychologically safe environments are environments where you feel like you can ask questions without being judged. And these all sound like obvious things, but actually my personal experience in the working world is that this is actually quite hard. These things are quite hard. You speak up and you might be blamed for something. There's a big blame culture. Whereas psychologically safe environments are environments where you feel safe about making mistakes, where you feel safe about failing, where you can, you know, ask questions and not deemed sort of, you know, you don't feel like you're being judged. These types of environments are what is necessary in terms of driving change and innovation in our organizations. So necessary. And I think when it comes to leading change, one of the key things, just to go back to the stress management thing, what we know is that if, you know, leaders' emotions are actually very, very contagious. And so if we as leaders, as managers, as parents even, don't manage our own stress response and regulate that response appropriately, we actually become very, very sort of contagious. We pass on those emotions. but also in terms of managing change, I think, just to go back to my point earlier, I think we've got to stop looking at change as a one-off. Like, once we get through this, everything's going to be all right and we're going to go back to normal. We really need to start thinking of change as an everyday part of business. It's business as usual, and change is every manager's job. Now, I'm a change management practitioner. I want to do myself out of a job because I just don't believe that the way to go about this is bringing in change experts that sort of just throw change pixie dust everywhere.
It has to be the DNA, doesn't it?
It has to
of
be
an organization. Yeah,
absolutely. And we need to build that capability, that competency in our teams, in ourselves, but it starts with that leadership level.
Yeah.
Because what I've seen occurs most often is sort of leaders saying one thing and acting a completely other way, which contradicts what they're saying. You know, they want agile organizations, they want I think,
are you looking at that question
there?
No,
back.
You're fine.
Okay,
you didn't freeze.
That they want sort of agile organizations, they want their team to be able to, you know, move quicker, and they sort of say to me, come in and like sort them out.
Yeah.
And it's
do
not
it to them. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not them, it's the leadership. It has to come from you. So we really have to build this this ability to lead change, and that all comes down to a few things, really. I think when we consider change management from the point of human behavior, the neuroscience and the psychology, and not just, we need to get the business from here to here. That is an important element, right? We need to work that process, but change doesn't happen unless people change. So we've got to focus on the people. And when we think about the neuroscience and the psychology, we realize often we get really focused on trying to eradicate resistance, right? If we just, you know, if there just wasn't any resistance, we'd be fine. And actually what we know is resistance to change is more natural than anything, right? It's the most natural thing to resist change. It's a survival mechanism. So what we've got to do instead is we've got to work around that. Now, I think that this is a tough time for every manager. I think whether you directly manage people or you facilitate project groups, or you just, in the case of like colleagues, you know, we're navigating the fear and the paranoia that's going to run wild, continue to run wild, even if you're saying, you know, jobs are safe, because there's going to continue to be job security, uncertainty, and, you know, more change. And I don't think it's necessarily the job that many have signed up to.
Yeah.
And we've got to make conscious decisions to lead in a way that is ethical, in a way that's not going to drive our workforces to burnout. You know, we've got an issue in the UK. I think it was even before the global pandemic. We've got, you know, one of the key reasons people going off stress, work-related stress, depression, anxiety is workplace change. That's much to do with how it's managed. People often, you know, the likelihood, I think Gallup did a study on the likelihood of, it was more likely, you know, the biggest reason that you're going to fall into burnout is the result of the way you're managed, right? Not necessarily the scope of work that you're dealing with.
The context,
the
and actually, just on that point, Jay, we've had a question in from Emily, and she's asking, what's the most effective way to communicate to my team that the pace of work is simply too intense, and that we need to change and slow it down, especially as we're coming out of the other side? I call it the slow thaw of the pandemic. Have you got any words of wisdom for Emily?
I think pace is a really, really important one. And when I talk about pace, I often refer to Sophie Devonshire's work around, her book was Lead at Speed. She interviewed 100 of the most successful CEOs and sort of leaders about how they deal with speed and working at speed in a sustainable way. How do we do that? We know the rate of change is increasing, but how do we manage this in a way that's sustainable? And so she talks about pace setting. Okay. And one of the examples she talked about is she talked about speed being an addictive drug for many leaders, right? We know that we need to go to speed to market and so on. And so they get this pace. And in the world of space and astronauts, they know the risk of perpetual speed. It's known as max Q. So this is the point when there is increasing speed and decreasing air density, and they're both at a maximum, which means any aircraft can only last for a limited amount of time without damage. And this is easier to measure, this point in an aircraft, right? Harder to do for ourselves and harder to do sometimes in business, but we need to keep checking in with ourselves and our teams to ensure that we're not rocketing straight into the point of no return, right? Because once we get to that point of no return, it's a straight nose. So once we get to that point where we think we're about to nosedive, that's where we really, really need to make those changes. And it sounds like that's where she's at now. And taking pauses when we need to at this point before we get to the diminishing returns is really important.
And it's around identifying and focusing on structuring your day, structuring your week, structuring your month and year, looking after your physical health and looking after your mental fitness as well.
I think you're right. There's so much that goes around that. You know, often when we talk about change, organizations just want to focus on, no, we're just focused on the change that's happening here. But I say, but you don't know how much change is going on in that person's. We have to look at it on an individual level, because if that person's moving house, they've just lost somebody they cared about, you know, there's lots of personal stuff that's going on, you know, they didn't get the pay rise, and now there's this big change restructure, that's going to impact that person in a very different way.
Absolutely. And I think it's an absolute investment to spend time on what I call the it, we and I. So of course, with that fast pace, let's get the let's get the profits, let's get the revenue, let's get the new ideas, let's get digital, let's get innovation, but also thinking about the relationships that make the whole of the success, and also spending time with each person in that team, thinking about, talking to them, getting them to share themselves, the I, what's important to them, what's going on for them, what's impacting them as they show up each day, I think is such an important responsibility really of a leader to give their team the place to bring themselves to work and really share what's going on for them, not just about what's going on at work.
Absolutely. I think you're dead on. And I also think what you said there was interesting as well, because I think what you're touching on there as well is the importance of connecting with teams and connecting with individuals, but also getting them involved in the change. Often what I see is we've got this change structure, look at this beautiful vision, it's going to be better for everyone, shiny, shiny, shiny. And then they wonder why everyone's resisting. Well, because nobody feels that, remember, to go back to control, we need to feel a sense of control. You've just taken everything away from them. You've taken all the choice, you've taken all the control. Of course, people are going to resist. They've had no input into it. So how can we manage change in a way, as a leader, your responsibility is to give the why and the what. Right? You give the why is this changing? Why are we doing this? What it is? And then you let your team do the how. And that how is so important because it allows them that co-creation. It allows them to be involved in whatever is happening. They are the experts, essentially. You've employed them for a reason. Now let them come up with the how. And that's a really, really important part of the change sort of management piece, is talking to them and understanding what challenges they're experiencing and letting them contribute in that way.
That's a really, really good top tip and reminder, because as you said, you know, though all of us, leaders or not, can get into that pace of wanting to get things done, and we forget the shadow that we cast, and we all cast shadows, don't we? But absolutely making sure that you're bringing people along the journey with you is vital for the success of the journey, but also the development and the buy-in from that team.
Absolutely. You know, and I think there's a statement from Jim Collins. I think he says, there was a question of, okay, how do you know when to go fast, when to go slow? Because that's the big question. How do you know? And I think he said, you know, move fast when you must, slow when you can. And I think that this also speaks to,
I'm just writing that down.
Move fast when you must, slow when you can. I think that also speaks to energy management. So I talk about energy management when we're talking about change and stress, because it's so critical. I think often we get in the corporate world, we get obsessed with time management. We're like, you know, we need to get more productive, we need to get more out of our time. And actually, I feel like time management is a waste of time. And I'm being a bit facetious there, because there is an element of it that we need. But if you've driven your team to be ever more efficient, ever more productive, and you've created this time, but you don't have the energy to utilize that time, whether it's from a personal point of view or a company point of view, company energy, to utilize that time, then what have you done? You've driven your team to burn out for this spare time. And so I think energy management, understanding that we need to manage our energy, which is ultimately, right, we keep producing energy, whereas time is finite. We only have a certain amount of time. So how can we be better at supporting our teams to manage their energy and our energy in effective ways, so that we can keep the pace going, and we go fast when we need to go fast, and we go slow when we need to go slow. So I feel like pace setting and good energy management is really, really critical for this next phase of lots of change, lots of uncertainty, because we need to keep moving. But that doesn't mean we need to keep moving at a ridiculous pace all of the time, because you're going to diminish that energy, and you need that energy. We need it more.
And we only have so much of it. You know, I call them my energy tokens, you know, and we all have to consciously choose how we spend them, to get the most out of the day, but also give us what we need at the same time to make that sustainable. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time, and I'm going to put something out there that we didn't talk about, but you've mentioned a few people, Jim Collins, you've mentioned a few, and it just made me think, because I know people will be thinking, gosh, how can I learn more about this? So I'm going to ask you, can you recommend 2 books or podcasts or articles that you think would be useful? I've got a couple that that came to mind simply as we were talking. So I'll go first to give you a little bit of time, because I have hijacked you on this one. So sorry, Jay.
That's all right. I want to hear yours.
That's fine. Well, as we were talking, something that I read and have on a DVD. God, that sounds so old, doesn't it? Sorry. That I often recommend to people, and it is a book by Spencer Johnson called Who Moved My Cheese, which is exactly about change. You're going to know these books. And the other one, which is my firm favorite, which is about helping people to understand, you know, what their patterns are and to have self-awareness, and it's called The Chimp Paradox by Steve Peters. I knew you'd know it.
Really?
And those were the 2 I'd throw out there. What about you, Jay?
So in terms of an article, which I think is very, very relevant to the situation that we're in, there's an article by Tara Haley. It's Tara and then Haelle. And she's a science journalist. It was called Your Surge Capacity is Depleted. It's Why You Feel Awful. I found that article fascinating. And she talks about how to pull yourself out of that feeling of despair and live your life, get back to living life. So I think from a personal point of view, personal change point of view, I'd recommend that. From a business leader point of view, I would definitely recommend Superfast, Lead at Speed by Sophie Devonshire, just because of the breadth of interviewees that she had. Incredible book on leading in a super fast world. In terms of a podcast, again, coming to sort of the more emotional context, how we can manage stress, all of those things. Brené Brown is
I love Brené Brown.
She features in a lot of my work. I love her sort of scientific database research, but she tells it in such a storytelling way, very impactful. So those are my 3.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I'd also just say to people, check out the AEO website. You know, we've talked a little bit about stress, about being overwhelmed. There's lots of resource there and signpostage there in the heads up section. So go and have a look if that's something that you think might be interesting to you. But Jay, I have absolutely loved spending the last 40 minutes with you. Your energy, your knowledge, is just inspiring, and thank you for sharing some of what you know and around this subject. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's been a pure joy. Thank you.
Okay, take care everyone. Goodbye.